I am Amy Wax. I am a professor at University of Pennsylvania Law School.
And I'm Glenn Loury of The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv, and my day job is teaching economics at Brown University.
Okay.
Amy.
So we're here to talk about political correctness, also known as PC.
Well, first of all, Amy, let me just say we're here to do The Glenn Show. I get a big kick I get a big kick out of welcoming guests to my own little TV show. So welcome to The Glenn Show. And yes, indeed, our topic today, by mutual consent, is political correctness. Go ahead. You were about to introduce it.
Okay. Well, political correctness, I'm not a big fan, Glenn.
Well,
I have to tell you that.
Who among us who are honest scholars and genuine intellectuals could be a fan of political correctness?
Well, I think the problem is that people who are, in my mind, fans of political correctness will never admit that they're fans of political correctness. They would never come out and say, well, you know, I believe in political correctness. They'll always call it something else, like civility or, you know, proper dialogue or even, you know, objectivity. They'll say that a particular opinion or statement has been decisively repudiated. They'll find a way to sort of shut down the dialogue. Or my favorite is, it's offensive. That is a great way to just shut everybody up and end the conversation.
Okay, so the problem, as you understand it, is that there are, as it were, conversation police out there trying to prevent people from saying stuff.
Definitely.
That makes them uncomfortable, or that's politically difficult, or whatever. And I gather you've been on the short end of this.
Well, I've been on the end of efforts trying to shut me up, yes. I mean, there have been many, many efforts. I like to think that I'm particularly resistant to them. I think I resist them for a lot of different reasons, more than other people. Some of them are temperamental. Some have to do with the way I try to say things that are unconventional. I try very hard to stick to the facts and not use incendiary language, and that I think is important, although I've been accused of being provocative. But once again, you know, these accusations are easy to make and hard to shut down or hard to resist. I think, you know, this is the kind of dialogue that benefits a great deal from particular examples.
Okay, but may I just interrupt before you go on? Because
sure.
We certainly want to talk about some specific examples of people trying to shut down the conversation.
Yes.
And all of that. But I wanted to kind of get some definitions on the table, if we could. I mean, political correctness in the eye of one beholder and civility in the eye of the other beholder. So maybe, you know, you could just say a few words about, I don't know, what's wrong with civility, or why we shouldn't take seriously people's concerns about offensive language and things of that kind.
Well, first of all, I want to say right up front that I don't think this is an easy open and shut question. I think what makes it interesting is that it's very hard. These distinctions are extremely difficult to make. I think there is such a thing as civility. I think it's important. I also, as a conservative, believe that private institutions, like, for example, private universities, private, you know, sort of journals of opinion, have the full right in our society to censure anyone and shut down any dialogue. So we do have the public-private distinction. Let's get it on the table. The First Amendment does not apply here. This is not a question of law. This is a question of wise conduct. So at the extreme, I am going to concede to you that there are statements, approaches that are beyond the pale. In any civilized society, there are going to be extremes of statement or opinion that everyone is going to abhor and are effectively going to be banned. Do I think that's that's necessary. I think it is necessary. And part of that is historical. Something like all Jews should be put into ovens and killed forthwith. I think that is the kind of statement that gets you sort of marginalized in decent society. But once again, I think those statements are rare. And the other thing to say is that it's context specific. So the context that as an academic I'm the most concerned about are not a dinner party or someone's living room or whatever, but the academy, right? And then the extensions of the academy, which are publications, magazines, journals of opinion. All of those entities and institutions are presumably dedicated to finding the truth, exploring ideas in a rigorous way, and then the First Amendment values come into the picture, not the First Amendment, but First Amendment values, which are the best response to false or meritless or baseless or obnoxious speech is more speech, that we ought to really go very far towards allowing people to say things which are false or baseless or obnoxious, because that's the only way we're really going to learn why they are that way. That is my view of it.
Well, that's an argument. That's an argument. Excuse me, Amy. I just wanted to point out that's a very old argument. The argument that our understanding of our own values and our own judgments is made firmer to the extent that we bother to refute people who speak contrary to what we believe, and that unburdening ourselves of the need to argue with them by telling them to shut up leads to a circumstance in which we no longer grasp whatever truths it is that we were prepared to affirm with the same degree of depth and certainty that we otherwise would have, because we haven't exercised our reasoning powers by bothering to refute people who disagree with us. So that's
you've made that argument, and it's I've read some of your work, and I agree. I think laziness. I just can't stand the laziness of the name calling I hear, what I call the ist language and the ism language. You're a racist. This is racism. I mean, this is just lazy talk.
Because, yeah, go ahead, Amy. Go ahead.
Because refuting an argument, even if you're absolutely convinced it's wrong, it's beyond the pale, it's stupid, it's obnoxious, is hard work. It is really hard work. You take it from me, because I'm often in the business of standing against received wisdom, and I'm glad it's hard work. I thrive on that hard work, but I think a lot of people on the left in the academy today feel they don't have to do it.
Okay, here's some arguments that I can imagine people who were in one way or another in favor of political correctness, even if they weren't prepared to admit it, might make. And I wonder how you react to them. One of them is, okay, a person should be able to say whatever they want, and I should be able to do whatever I want with what they say. So if a person says something that suggests to me that they have abhorrent values, then I should be free to ostracize them or react sharply to them. I don't just have to argue with them. I can not invite them to dinner. I can, not show up for their lecture or whatever it might be. And they may be injured by the fact that I react harshly to their statements. Yes. But they should be prepared to take responsibility for the consequences of what they say, one of which may be that they find themselves no longer as popular as they once were. Maybe sponsors don't want to advertise on their show anymore, or maybe guests don't want to come when invited, and this sort of thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's one kind of argument a person might make. If you're prepared to have obnoxious opinions, then be prepared to be treated like an obnoxious person. Yeah,
well, that's a tough one, and I actually think that there are realms. Once again, I'm going to use this concept of spheres. So certainly in a social sphere, I'm 100% behind that. Right? Yeah, let's discriminate. I believe in private discrimination sort of socially, in the sense that someone says something obnoxious who shows they don't share our values, they're not coming to our dinner, they're not going to be part of our social circle, we might, boycott them in various settings. I remember someone telling me an off-color joke, and I said to a friend, that was a really offensive joke. And my friend said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, I'm going to think less of the person that told it. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to think less of them because that's my right. But here, let's talk about the academy, which is where a lot of this is occurring, right? And I think in the academy, the ostracism, the boycotting, the marginalization comes at too great a cost. Yeah, if somebody says obnoxious things that you totally disagree, remember, the academy is not a political institution. It is an institution dedicated to finding the truth. And that is a very different function. That is a very different function from building coalitions, building tensions.
Let me just get a comment in here for a minute. I will agree with you that the academy ought not to be as political as it is, but I wonder whether or not it's possible to conceive of any institution that is, as it were, not political. That is to say, it should be devoted to achieving the truth, but in fact, it's a venue for a lot of stuff, including political posturing, career making, power, grabbing, and all the rest. So, yeah, the academy is a political institution, just like just about every other institution in our society.
Okay, well, you're talking about realism and what it
That's
is,
right.
because
That's
we're all
right.
fallen creatures, and we fall short of the ideal. So I'm going to give you that. Okay,
All right. So
I'm
that's
talking
fine.
about normatively what our goals and ideals and aspirations should be.
Understood. And you're especially concerned about the fact that people try to shut down arguments inside the universities by calling people racist or sexist or whatever.
I think that should never happen. Okay.
Okay.
I think you can okay, you're going to want to label somebody, but you can't stop there because it's lazy. It's just doesn't advance the mission of the academy.
I think we agree about that. Let me. However, I just want to review some of these arguments that people will make, and one of the arguments is that be prepared to accept ostracism if you say something that's obnoxious. And I gather you don't have a problem with that, except within the context of the academy, you'd rather the institution not reinforce this tendency by, penalizing people who say unpopular things. But, I mean, hey, kids might not take your classes, right? If you give lectures that they find to be politically off base, they may stop coming to your classes. That would be, they'd vote with their feet in that respect, or they may not buy your books or whatever it is, And I assume that's okay.
Well, that I think really represents a marginal case. So, frankly, my honest opinion is, and I will tell you my honest opinion, I don't think it's appropriate to boycott classes of someone because that person says things that you disagree with or thinks are meritless as such. I actually don't think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate to not go to a class or not take a class because you're not interested in it or because you think the teacher's not a good teacher or something of that sort. That I think is appropriate. Once again, I'm going back to basic academic values and what I think the academy is there for. It's not to make us comfortable. It's not to sort of create a warm bath experience. It's not to sort of foster political solidarity. It's not to have a circle jerk where we're stroking each other. And
no, we both agree about that. On the other hand, I would want to avoid someone who I thought was biased, who I thought had a biased point of view on a subject, whatever the subject might be. And if I heard them speak and I came to the conclusion from the strong opinions that they took, all Jews should be put into the oven or some extreme thing of this kind, all blacks should go back to the jungle where they came from. And I decide, well, on the basis of that, I'm not going to bother with listening to what this person has to say. That seems to me to be a prudential judgment and nothing more, really. It's not a boycott in the sense of political ostracization because of an unpopular view. It's a judgment about how best to make use of my time and what speech is worth attending to and what speech is best relegated to a category of propaganda or whatever. No?
Well, I think obviously we all make judgments about how to use our time and whether what someone says is worthwhile or, analytically sound or baseless or has something behind it. We can't avoid those judgments. Right? What I'm really pleading for is an extreme degree of tolerance and open-mindedness, because I think the best way to learn is to say, now, why is it that I think this person is wrong? What is it about what they have said that is wrong? Okay, let me give you a couple of examples, because I think we're talking at a very abstract level here.
Okay, I'm going to do this the last time, Amy. I just want to get it framed before we get into the examples. And so one of the arguments was, if a person is unpopular, speaking unpopular, then I can ostracize them. There are the arguments about incitement and the arguments about hurt feelings, and I also wanted to get on the table before we got into the examples. So the incitement argument is, if you let people speak like that and don't punish them, that'll just make people think it's legitimate to talk like that, and then bad values will get greater air in society. So a neo-Nazi has to be ostracized and treated as a disreputable speaker, otherwise neo-Nazism will become, And the hurt feelings argument is, well, if you talk like that, the gays are going to feel bad, or the women are going to feel bad, or the blacks are going to feel bad, or the Jews are going to feel bad, and they've suffered enough. We don't want to make them feel bad, and therefore people who speak like that are going to be held in bad odor, are going to be punished. So there's the incitement argument and the hurt feelings argument. And again, I'm just wondering how you respond to them.
Well, the incitement argument, I think, has something to it if we're talking about the political realm, right? So if we're saying, well, what are we going to do about, a neo-Nazi movement that's a political movement to take power, and it's really sort of going from a debating society to an effort to actually influence people, I think then we have to start to think about political action as well as refutation. So that's hard. That becomes something a little bit harder. Once again, I think we should err on the side of not seeing it as, political, but rather seeing it as an argument. So that is the way I would treat that. But once again, when we're in the academy, and here a harder case is publication. So, an editor of a publication deciding not just what's going to be published in his journal, which I think is a legitimate function of an editor, but even sort of firing people because of stuff that they say. Well, we've had examples of that recently. That really goes beyond that. So those are hard issues. But if we're just going to stick with the academy, which is not a political institution, it is a debating society. And it is an institution dedicated to figuring out what is true and what is not true, what is analytically sound and what is false. I'm sorry, I have a huge tolerance for what anybody might say that it is now incumbent upon me to address on the merits, however obnoxious and awful it might seem. And, there are things that get said that really I do find offensive, but I think we have to just get past that. Offense cannot be a ground for shutting someone up. Because I think once we go down that road, and I see it in my students, I see it in other faculty, people are intimidated, the truth gets distorted, and I can give particular examples of things that get said which are clearly not true, and they just keep being perpetuated. And they have real consequences.
Well, as you know, because you looked at this old essay of mine on political correctness that I wrote back in the 90s, I substantially agree with much of what you've said about the intellectually damaging consequences of this practice, this kind of, we slap people on the back if they agree with us, and we slap them in the face if they disagree with us, or worse. That's afoot. I mean, it is corrupting in many ways the function of institutions like the academy, as you pointed out. So, we're going to probably find something to argue about here, but that's not going to be it. Maybe you should talk about the examples that you've been suggesting, and maybe we can find some ground to disagree on something. I don't know, Amy. I'm
okay.
Just, if we get to the end of this conversation without arguing with one another,
that'll be very boring.
It's also unlikely, so let's go on.
Okay. Well, I'm going to admit right up front that, of course, the hot button issues are, you know, race, sex, sexuality, that poverty, you know, nature versus nurture. I mean, that sort of stuff is I think, where we get into trouble. But let me raise something that's a little bit cooler, that is not so incendiary, that happened recently. Recently, on the front page of the New York Times, there was an article about food deserts. So this idea was afloat that the reason that lower middle class people or minorities tend to be fatter or have much more obesity than richer people or non-minorities is that they live in these communities which don't have access to good fresh food. They're the so-called food deserts. They have no access to good food. Now, of course, that's an idea that a lot of people loved because it identifies the problem as external to the individuals and their own behavior and their own choices. And this is always sort of a more popular way of thinking about a social problem than blaming the victim, quote unquote.
Well, hold on. Now you're imputing motives to the people for liking the argument, but that's okay. Never mind.
Well, I'm guessing.
How do you know that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of theorizing here about why this argument is such a popular argument. And
in any case, it's a popular argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, mixing the social and the academic, I was just going to tell an anecdote that I was out in limousine liberal land on the main line at someone's house, you know, in a very affluent neighborhood, and this the owner of the house very confidently told me about a year ago that this was the reason. Okay, and this guy was a medical professional. He said that the reason that we have these differences is because there's no access to good, fresh, healthy food. And, of course, I was in a social setting. I was a guest in someone's home, so I wasn't going to start an argument. But, you know, I come back and sit at my desk, and I see the evidence, and I know it's not true. And yet people are reluctant to say, no, it's a much more complicated problem. It's a behavioral problem. It's a problem of choices that people are making that are bad choices. One is reluctant to say that. You know, we shouldn't be reluctant to float that as a theory, and we should be required to back it up. We should be going out and actually looking at the evidence and doing the studies. But if we're afraid to even think the thought, Glenn, we are not going to go looking for the evidence. That is the problem. That is social science bias, and it exists.
Food deserts, I mean, granted, there are people who are enamored of a certain argument and they will be resistant to evidence to the contrary of it. I think this is a general human psychological tendency to discount evidence that disconfirms a pre-existing hypothesis. In fact, I think the psychologists have a fair amount of laboratory evidence to the effect that our perceptual mechanisms actually, you know, fool us. And we don't see stuff that will cause us to have to reevaluate our beliefs as easily as we see stuff that would reaffirm our beliefs. And I'll bet that I could find as many examples to the right of the center aisle politically in which people are skeptical about this or that claim that's been advanced by the scientific research community, because this or that claim, whether it be about environmental science or about the genetic predisposition to homosexuality or whatever, is inconsistent with their pre-existing views. So I guess the burden of what I'm saying here is, yeah, I think we're observing something about human nature to the extent that we observe people resist evidence contrary to arguments that are especially dear to their hearts. And I don't know that it has any particular political bite, either left or right. What do you think?
Well, no, I don't think it necessarily does have a particular political bite, but I think as an actual matter on the ground, sort of as a reflection of where we are today in society, the fact is that the left has much more influence in the academy. So what that means in practice is that the arguments that are darlings of the left, that the left favors, tend to get a pass or tend to get less critical treatment I really do believe this to be so. I mean, I've been an academic for many years now, and I've seen it. I see it all the time.
Okay, well,
whereas the arguments on the right, well, they don't get any more critical treatment either. I mean, they're just sort of dismissed, you know, and nobody feels like they have to refute them or take them on the merits at all. So the left arguments get a pass and the right arguments get dismissed. So there is a bias built into the system just because of who tends to teach at universities.
Yeah, but I don't want to, I would rather we not limit our discussion about political correctness to the universities, granting that that's an important venue, because, you know, we have this whole big conversation going on out in our society about, I don't know what, our foreign policy, or I don't know what, about race relations or whatever, not just in the academy. I mean, I somehow remember, I don't know, Barack Obama having to put on a flag pin in his lapel, or every candidate having the genuflect at the altar of American exceptionalism, or nobody being able to question our policy in the Middle East in terms of how we position ourselves in the Arab-Israeli conflict for fear that they will fall out of favor in contemporary American discourse. Or, and I could go on in this vein, if I'm a Republican, I have to have a certain view about abortion. I have to have a certain view about taxes. There are only so many things that I can say about the function of government or about welfare reform. Or every candidate has to affirm the middle class as that set of Americans whose welfare is most of interest. Nobody can actually say, I'm for the poor in American society, or for that matter, I'm for the rich in American society without being pilloried or driven to the margins of our public conversation. So, I mean, don't you agree with me that this problem is really much, much bigger than what I will acknowledge to be some of the parochialism and narrow-mindedness that's characteristic of some of the academic world?
Yeah, I mean, I abhor all of that because I think it doesn't help us get to good policy very often. So I'm going to agree with you. But on the other hand, when you're in politics, then, you know, very often what you're doing is you're representing a point of view that is fundamentally a normative one about what a good society is, and it depends less on what the facts are. I mean, very often it does depend on what the facts are. But sometimes you're just saying, you know, I think society is better if, or I think that it makes for a better society if, and a lot of that is just your sort of vision, your conception of what the important values are. I mean, here I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt, whose book, recent book, I have many quarrels with, The Righteous Mind, and I think it's, in some ways, it's incomplete, but he does get at this idea that we have different value sets. And
I'm sorry. Amy, I'm sorry, I don't know the book.
It's called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T.
Okay.
So, you know, when we're talking about politics and which vision of society is going to dominate, very often we just kind of represent those positions because we're convinced that they're right. I'm really talking about something different, which is when what matters is what the facts are. You know, John Maynard Keynes says, when the facts change, I change my mind. What about you?
What do you do? Exactly.
Then I think we're talking about some really pernicious effects of political correctness, which is that we are operating on defective premises. And when we do that, to formulate policies, to make convictions about, or to adopt convictions about the good society, when we are basing these on faulty facts and arguments, you know, logical arguments from facts, then I think that's a formula for frustration, for wasted resources. That's a formula for a bad society.
Okay, so
I'm going to distinguish here between value systems and the facts that inform those value systems.
Okay, let's talk about an example then of how we're getting important social facts wrong because of the pernicious effects of political correctness.
Well, I'll give you an example. I'm just kind of coming up with one off the top of my head, right? So I have a friend who recently published an article that shows the following. If you look only at junior academics, that is junior professors in prestigious universities, and you look at men and women, what you find is that the women spend a lot more time taking care of their children, and when you ask them why, they say it's because they enjoy it more than the men enjoy the very same activities. So this is a very controlled study where specific questions are asked. So this goes to the question of, why is it that women are promoted less rapidly, don't rise as high, or not as well represented in prestigious positions? So there's two possibilities. One is it's discrimination, okay, and the institutions are discriminating, or people are discriminating, they're not accommodating these women, and the answer lies in the institution, so there has to be reform, and there has to be extra help or whatever. And the other possibility is they're not being discriminated against, they just prefer to live their life this way. Now, I don't actually think that, what institutions ought to do for either of these is all that different, frankly, at the bottom, but it matters what the truth is here. It really does matter.
So how is political correctness keeping anybody from getting at that truth? This is the question I have.
Well, I think that the people who do research in this area, except this one guy who's a renegade, okay, this guy is unorthodox and he's been marginalized. He's not part of the mainstream by any means. I won't name his name. But, I will.
Why not? I mean,
his
it's
name
a
is
study.
Stephen Rhodes, right? Rhoads.
Oh, I know him. He's a political scientist at the University of Virginia. No?
That's right.
Yeah, I know him very well. He has a wonderful book out there, The Economist View of the World, which is a book I've often used in my public policy courses because it explains very clearly how economists think about policy problems and how political scientists think differently about policy. Yeah, he's a first-rate political scientist. So
but
anyway,
he has an interest in
I'm prepared to vouch for him.
And I think his interest is that he thinks that a lot of the stuff that's said about it is bullshit. Okay, so I think that's part of it.
Okay, but I'm still at the level of saying, okay, he publishes a study, some people don't like it, and they give him some flack. But I don't see how come if he's right, he doesn't win, because that study will be replicated by other studies, and the facts will win out in the end. How is it that somebody treating him less cordially than they otherwise might keeps us from getting at the facts about what causes a relatively lower rate of tenuring amongst female junior faculty members?
Well, first of all, you're assuming a lot. You're assuming it will be replicated. You're assuming that it will be paid attention to, and it's actually, the reason I bring it up is because I think it's an extraordinary and exceptional case of someone pursuing a renegade hypothesis, and it's so salient and so unusual that it's almost unique. I mean, this rarely happens. If you go to mainstream sociology departments and gender study departments, nobody is looking at these alternative hypotheses. People will not even look at it. They will not even look at it. The research is designed not to get at the wrong answer, right? I mean, in fact, I will actually read to you, here's a bio of someone who's working at Columbia University who's taking part in a special program that I'm involved in. I'm not going to give her name, okay, because I don't want to cast aspersions on her. She looks at stressors and low socioeconomic status, the influence of those on the brain and on behavior and health. That's her area of expertise. And here's what she says about her research. This is really interesting. This research aims to lay the groundwork for interventions for better parenting in the future, but it is not designed to engender the idea that SES determines any outcome. I mean, this is somewhat announcing the result that her research is designed to get.
Okay, fair enough.
Fair enough. Astonishing.
No, well, you have demonstrated once again that there exist people whose research is biased by their political views. I kind of already knew that, but I take the point, okay? But so here's the thing. I mean,
and she's not embarrassed about writing that.
Yeah.
Fine.
But it's an open arena. This academic competition to publish articles, to do research, to write books, and to get at the truth. And to the extent that a particular research community, because of its bias, neglects to investigate this question or that, they leave a huge opening or an opportunity for somebody else, perhaps someone who doesn't share those same value commitments, to enter in and to make a name for themselves by refuting what they had previously believed to be the case. I mean, I just don't believe we don't get to the truth because of this effect that you're talking about. I know the effect is there, bias influencing how research is conducted, even at a global level for certain research communities. But I don't believe that the effect that you're concerned about is there, namely, we end up not knowing what we otherwise might know because people are politically correct. And the reason I don't believe it is that it only takes one or a few, and we're a country of 300 million people, and everybody in the academy is ambitious, wants to get published, wants to get tenure, and wants to make a name for himself or herself. So that's why, even though the studies about the effects of busing, I mean, just to bring up one of these old politically correct issues, you know, does busing cause white flight? Yeah. Well, the answer turns out to have been yes.
That is so old hat, Clint.
But here's my point. My point is that when James Coleman, the sociologist, the late great sociologist, first began to suggest that this was the case in the early 70s, they called him a racist. However, by the time you get to the late 1980s, nobody can deny the fact that busing caused or could cause white flight because the data were just so overwhelming, and you know the politically correct people got run over by the facts. You know, and I think I could give many examples of just that kind of effect. I mean, let me just give one more. When Abigail Thurstrom, someone whose work you may know, was writing about the adverse effects on American democracy of racially gerrymandered voting districts, and pointing out that they distorted in all kinds of ways the electoral process and the processes of representing people in the legislature, the federal and state legislatures, she was pilloried because that was supposed to be against the Voting Rights Act and bad for blacks and whatnot. But again, the data just keep coming in, okay? And at the end of the day, I don't know any serious student of American politics who would not affirm that, I don't know, the Georgia congressional delegation is much more Republican and much more conservative, and that the effective representation of African Americans' interests from the state of Georgia is undermined by the fact that they've drawn and redrawn these districts in such a way as to cram all the black voters into a relatively few, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, while Abigail Thurstrom suffered for a long time in the wilderness, the facts eventually went out. And then finally, and I'll stop, my point is people who adopt correct but unpopular opinions need to have the courage of their convictions. And retreating to a complaint about political correctness may just be a way of avoiding the inescapable reality, which is that in order for an unpopular truth to win out, it has to be championed by people who are prepared to accept the slings and arrows of outrageous social fortune. What do you say to that?
Yes, I agree with that. And having been the target of those slings and arrows, I understand the price of doing business. Being marginalized is tough. I just don't think that, once again, I don't think most ordinary people who go into academia or any profession maybe have the taste for that, have the stomach for that, and that has an effect. It has an effect. It keeps people out, and especially with the tenure system where people are worried about getting tenure. It's just the word on the street is if you're worried about getting tenure, you really have to be careful what you say during your pre-tenure period. It is a dangerous thing to go out on a limb on some of these really hot-button issues. That's just the fact. Now, if you're going to tell me, well, that's the way it is, that's human nature and all that, I'd say, well, fine. Human nature is what we're put on earth to rise above. So if we have these ideals about, what our institution should be and the importance of getting to the truth, making correct factual statements, because in the end, that is going to make for better understanding and better policies and better solutions, then we have to refrain from punishing people, or at least punishing them that harshly, and do the hard work. Now, there is this other problem that, for better or worse, and, for whatever reason, and there's speculation about why it is, the academy, people across the political spectrum are not well represented in the academy. There's also a kind of education problem, which is, I think, their political correctness is so dominant in the academy now that we are not fostering the kind of independent thought and boldness in our young people that we need. We're fostering fear and the desire to accommodate political correctness. I mean, I've seen it. I see it every day. That people are not willing to even countenance or contemplate views that they know are not acceptable, and if they do it, they're punished. I will give the example of Stephanie Grace, this poor Harvard law student. This was a while back now, who in a private email to some so-called friend of hers, I wouldn't call this person a friend, dared, in talking about her thesis at Princeton as an undergrad in a sort of post-conversational email, said that she thought the evidence on the sources of cognitive differences between the races was inconclusive. She didn't even say she believed one theory or another. She just said she thought the evidence was incomplete.
I heard about this.
Which actually is a perfectly plausible thing to say.
It's a defensible claim. I agree.
Yeah, and she just said it. And this friend proceeded to, forward her email to the entire Harvard Law School community, which shows a terrible lack of judgment.
I get the point.
Yeah,
I get the point.
Well, you know the story. So she was forced to sort of grovel and apologize. Martha Minow, the dean of Harvard Law School, I think behaved abysmally. If I had been Martha Minow, I would have said to the black students who complained, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail," and that would have been the end of it. Right?
Okay,
so that has to do with privacy.
You've got that one on the record, but let me try to redirect the conversation now back to this issue of who's really got the power in a circumstance in which a PC battle is going on. Because I have a hypothesis, and I wonder how you react to it. I mean, often when I've seen these dust-ups, like the one at the Harvard Law School, here you have, in effect, African Americans and our liberal supporters defending the race, quote unquote, defending the race against the possible imputation of some kind of intrinsic intellectual inadequacy, when we are doing so in the face of facts, very visible and observable facts of huge disparities in the achieved intellectual abilities of people in different racial groups. So the bell curves overlap, but they are very disparate at the mean on IQ tests and so forth. This is a first-order fact that sort of hints at the possibility of intrinsic intellectual inferiority of blacks. And in reaction to that, certain liberal and racially affiliated communities will take someone like this young person that you mentioned at Harvard Law School and punish them for saying the wrong thing. Now, here in the face of that is what I want to say. What I want to say is that is a weapon of the weak. That kind of PC policing of speech and punishing of deviance is the last resort of people who don't have any other arguments. They're weak. They're not strong. We should pity them, not fear them. I don't know why anybody fears a cabal of people who have no facts or no arguments, but are just telling other people to shut up. Obviously, such people are desperate. They're in a position of weakness.
Well,
when you actually have to...
Yes, but anyway. It happens every day. I mean...
But these are not...
Hello? Hello?
Little ghettos in which they live, and they really are weak, not strong. They're not going to win any elections out there. It's a rear guard action. They're holding on by their fingernails.
Well,
I feel sorry for them.
I agree that I wouldn't even call it weak. I would call it lazy. Right? That's the word that comes to my mind. It's too hard. As upsetting as it is to think about what the causes of these irrefutable facts are, that there are these measured differences, of course, that we can't deny, but it's hard work. It turns out to be incredibly complicated to get at cause and effect, and it requires higher level math skills and psychometrics, and it's really complicated stuff. So nobody wants to get into it because it's too hard. It's just easier to name call, punish, shame, and I think that happens over and over and over again. And yeah, you're saying that it's an evidence of weakness. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop it from happening. You're not in the mainstream here because it's happening all over the country. It's happening, on same-sex marriage, on homosexuality, on gender difference, on race difference. Those are the really, really sensitive topics. And the problem is that it matters because there's so many sort of policies and programs in our society that really do take as a given certain theories about causes and cures that may be totally false.
Okay, I just want to add here. I'm struck by the fact that Sarkozy came in second in that election for the president of France,
right,
behind the guy who calls himself a socialist. Okay, the socialist candidate in France got more votes than did Sarkozy. Whereas it is an epithet to say of anybody who is an American politician striving for high office that they're a socialist. Now, I'm giving the example in order to make this point, Amy. The political correctness bugaboo that you and I are concerned about is much, much more profound than the policing of conversations that's undertaken by left liberals within the universities. You can't even be a socialist in this society without being driven from the political arena. And frankly, there's nothing wrong a priori with it. It may not be the wise policy. We may at the end of the day vote against it, but it oughtn't to have been disqualifying to call oneself a socialist. Anyway, end of my little rant. I'm just trying to say it's a much bigger issue. I mean, again, don't you agree? A much bigger issue than,
Of course it is, but I'm trying to I'm trying to bite off a tiny piece of it because if we make it too big, we're not going to get anywhere. So.
You know what? I think we've had a great conversation, Amy. I think we're probably at a point where we could conclude it.
Yes.
On my claim about weakness and your complaint about laziness, at least we both agree that PC is not the way to go in the academy or without. So.
Well, thank you. This was very interesting.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.